No doubt you've been talking in class, particularly about the difference between primary and secondary sources and what makes a good primary source. But I want to talk a little bit about the types of secondary sources that you're going to need to find for serious history research, like the stuff you're going to do for this class and other upper division history classes. So, the general definition of a secondary source is any source that was produced after a historical event, period, issue, whatever. So, a New York Times article that was published during the Civil War is primary if you're writing a paper about the Civil War. And then somebody talking about the Civil War later, let's say in the New York Times in an issue that comes out today, is going to be secondary because it was written later. But that's a really broad definition and isn't exactly what we mean when we say you need to find secondary sources for your research project. Because, of course, lots of people talk about history after the fact. People write books and publish magazine and journal articles. There are Wikipedia and other types of encyclopedia entries. There are some great podcasts. People might talk about it on Facebook. Uh, People make videos about history. There's all sorts of conversations that happen about history after the fact. So, what do we really mean? Well, when it comes to serious history research, like the kind of stuff you're going to be asked to do in this class and other upper division classes, what we really want are books and journal articles. So let's talk a little bit more about those. It's pretty much required for any serious history project to track down scholarly books and scholarly journal articles related to your topic. You can also make a case for using other types of sources so long as they are scholarly, but it's pretty much a requirement to find the first two. So what do I mean by scholarly sources? These go by a couple of different names. You might also hear them referred to as research sources, peer-reviewed sources, or refereed sources. And these terms all mean the same thing. They mean sources that are written by experts for other experts. In the case of history, it would be a book, a journal article written by an expert historian for an audience of other expert historians or students like yourself, people who know a lot about the topic. So, how can you tell if you're looking at a scholarly source? Well, one thing that sometimes gives things away is the name of the publisher. If you ever see a university press as the publisher, that can be a good sign. But more than anything, there are going to be two things you're going to look for. The first is that the author is an expert. There should be somewhere on the journal article or book a little blurb telling you who the author is and their expertise. Frequently, that's advanced degrees, or they're a professor or some other kind of researcher working at a university, but it should always tell you in black and white this person is an expert on this topic. The other thing you're going to look for is carefully documented evidence in the form of footnotes, endnotes, whatever you want to call them. Every time somebody uses a source, primary or secondary, in a serious scholarly work, they have to document that source. And in history and most other fields, that is done through footnotes and notes, detailing the full information about the source and maybe even giving you a little bit more information. So, okay, I have to find scholarly books and journal articles, but why? How am I going to use those in a paper? Well, there are a couple of different things that secondary sources can do for you as you think about your analysis and then write it up in your paper. And the first of those is it can provide context. Let's say you're writing a paper about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that happened in the early 1900s in New York City. Well, you might need to know a bit about the role of women in labor in the early 20th century. You might need to know a bit about labor in general in the early 20th century. And you might want to know a bit about the period too. Secondary sources can help you fill in these kind of bigger picture questions and topics so that you don't have to go and read all of the primary sources one would need to read to understand those topics. The other thing that secondary sources are useful for is to be able to check and see if other historians have looked at your topic similar or slightly different ways. What did they find? You're going to need to compare what you find with other historians who've looked at the same topic. And the other thing that's very useful to do with secondary sources is to contrast. So again, let's say we're looking at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Well, we might be interested in looking up other big labor accidents that happened in the early 20th century. What caused those? How were they handled? What was public reaction? So, looking up similar but different topics can help you compare and contrast. In terms of actually tracking down these secondary sources, there will be more videos and, most importantly, in-class workshops where you are going to go over all of this step by step with Kendra. For now, all you need to do is to remember that you've got to find secondary sources. You're going to need to look for both scholarly books and scholarly journal articles. And that in terms of your analysis, you're looking for sources that will provide context, that will allow you to compare your findings with what other historians have found, and that will allow you to contrast your findings with what other historians have found.